What's up, guys? It's Rob here, and we've got to talk about what's going on in the stock market because there are a bunch of threats to the stock market that are making stocks cheap at the moment. And there is one new specific threat that I felt was worth mentioning for anyone who hadn't heard of it. And today I just wanted to kind of go over what's going on, what's making these stocks so cheap. Because if you look at the chart, you can see stocks are dropping again today, and they have been dropping for the past while. I mean, the stock market's been on a tear to the downside, and it's unfortunate to see for people who are very heavily invested, but over the long run, I do expect that a lot of these threats will clear themselves up, and we'll talk about why once we start breaking them down. But overall, I'm not too worried about these threats lasting forever, right? I think that these threats that we're going to talk about are probably going to eventually go away, and eventually stocks will return to less fearful valuations and more realistic levels, right? I think so. Right now, the biggest threat that people are worried about in the market are rate hikes. Okay, Powell's been raising rates. He's doing this actually to fight another threat, to fight inflation. And it's a reasonable thing to do, right? You do want to be raising rates to fight inflation. You don't want inflation to completely overwhelm the economy, but it does mean that there is a incentive to no longer be holding stocks, right? When rates are going up, he's incentivizing people holding cash because then you're getting more interest on the cash that you hold. So it makes sense that rate hikes overall aren't the best thing for the stock market. People tend to over-exacerbate the fear, though, right? They tend to oversell stocks when they fear these rate hikes. You know, oftentimes the news of rate hikes is worse than the actual effect of rate hikes. I mean, I don't expect rates to go anywhere near where stocks typically return on average, but we'll see what goes on with it. Inflation, on the other hand, is a big issue for the market and the world as a whole, right? And things are getting more expensive, whether it's due to supply chains, whether it's due to some of these other threats like rising fuel costs due to the war in Ukraine. But overall, inflation, yeah, that's a big worry. It shouldn't last forever. We've looked at the charts before. We've broken it down. We've seen that there are sometimes big spikes up in inflation. Right now, the Fed is doing what they can to fight it. But the inflation, a lot of it, was caused by all the money printing that we saw over the course of the past couple of years. And there was massive money printing. There was massive stimulus. I do expect that, we'll be living with higher prices in the future just because now there's so much more cash in the system. The Fed is trying to stop prices from continuing to rise forever. They'll likely continue to rise for a bit. I mean, just as people come to terms with how much more cash is out there. And obviously, there are other things causing the inflation. The fuel costs, right? That's going up because of the sanctions in Russia and Ukraine due to the war going on. And these fuel costs will probably eventually come down, not as low as they were in the past. These are probably going to be inflated as well. Once again, there's just a lot more cash out there. And when you dramatically increase the supply of cash, you increase what people can afford to buy. And thus, people are buying more products, and the prices of those products have to go up unless the supply of those products also increases it to the same extent that the cash is increased in terms of supply. And that doesn't always happen. Over time, it does, because technologies allow things to be made more easily and more effectively and for cheaper. But in the short term, we're probably going to be dealing with not just inflation in everyday goods, but inflation in fuel as well. And the next threat, before we get to the new thing that's going on, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine is persisting a lot longer than people were thinking it might. I mean, people thought this would be a couple of days, a couple of weeks. They probably didn't expect Ukraine to hold out as well as they have been. And while I'm glad they've been able to hold out, it's certainly causing a lot of tension and fear for markets because they're not just worried about what's going to happen in Ukraine. Now there are a bunch of other European countries that are near Russia who are thinking about joining NATO. Russia's making threats, threatening them not to join NATO. And people are worried that this whole situation could turn into something a lot worse for the rest of the world than it's already pretty bad, but it could potentially turn into something worse if the right actions aren't taken and if people make the wrong decisions. It could be a bad situation overall. So there are a lot of things to be fearful of, and it certainly doesn't help that something new just got dropped on us. Monkeypox, right? Monkeypox is spreading around the world. We can see it's already spread to Germany. It's in the UK, Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Sweden, the United States, and Australia. Okay, all of these places have confirmed cases. Now, this probably wouldn't be as big of a deal if we hadn't just gotten out of a pandemic and people weren't already very worried about it, because human-to-human transmission most commonly occurs through respiratory droplets and usually requires prolonged face-to-face contact. So it's not as contagious as COVID, at least according to my understanding, right? It seems like it's not nearly as contagious, and that's a good thing because when you see what it is, it doesn't look too good, right? So fortunately, it doesn't seem to be as contagious, but it is still something that's spreading. It's still something that people are worried about. And, it's just another threat, another fear being thrown onto the market, causing us to move down. Now, in my opinion, it's causing us to move down to levels that are fairly cheap, right? When you look at the long term of the stock market, I'll pull it up right here. You can see that over the past many years, we've actually been at these levels before, right? We've moved down so much that we're actually at levels where we were at in 2018. And fortunately, that means there are some buying opportunities out there, right? Of course, stocks are going to be moving down dramatically when there are all of these fearful catalysts, rate hikes, inflation, fuel costs, war in Ukraine, monkeypox, right? There's obviously a lot going wrong at the moment. However, what's important to remember is that markets often overreact a little bit, right? They get a little bit lower in the short term than they typically end up. And over the long term, they do tend to rise despite the falls that we might see. The falls tend to not last that long. And this fall in smaller market cap stocks has already been going on for more than half a year. The S&P has been falling for about half a year at this point. It's a situation where stocks have been getting relatively cheap. And granted, there are a lot of threats. There are a lot of things causing this. Over the long term, I expect that these things will dissipate, right? We're not going to be dealing with rate hikes forever. Eventually, we'll get to a certain place where rates will stay steady and potentially start decreasing once inflation has started coming down. Since we're not necessarily putting out as much stimulus as we were over the past couple of years, this monkeypox thing will hopefully clear itself up, right? There's no telling what's going on with that. Hopefully, it doesn't become too bad. As for Russia and Ukraine, hopefully that situation resolves itself as well. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you don't expect to go on forever. Once it does resolve itself, fuel costs should be on the decline at least temporarily, right? Moving back down to somewhat more reasonable levels. So overall, these threats, it's tough to think of, but they don't last forever, right? Nothing lasts forever. And overall, I think we'll be dealing with a much friendlier market in the months and years to come. But we are in a tough market at this moment. And fortunately, if you've got some cash on hand, it means you can get some pretty good deals. So other than that, guys, keep in mind, none of this is financial advice. I'm not making any recommendations. I'm just letting you guys know my opinion, what I think about the situation. And if you appreciate that, feel free to subscribe. And other than that, have a great day. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.